Warren Buffett, the multi-billionaire businessman and philanthropist, once said it takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to destroy it. As in any venture in life, a good start isn't enough. And that's true whether it's politics or sports or religion. All of us can probably relate to beginning a new exercise program or a new diet or a new home project or a class in school. And it doesn't take long before that diet's not quite working out. The exercise gets put off. The home project, well, I can do that next weekend. We get out of the starting gate like a hungry greyhound chasing that rabbit. But as time goes on, we tire out. Some don't even finish the race. The reality is trophies are only given to those who cross the finish line. They don't give trophies out for a 95-yard dash. And so in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul's going to use this race analogy as he talks about our journey of faith. He's still answering the question that came to us in chapter 8 and verse 1. Is it okay to eat meat that has been sacrificed to idols? Which Paul uncovered that behind that question is really, how far can I go in my liberties even if somebody else doesn't like what I'm doing? In chapter 8, he showed us that we have no right to injure a weaker brother or sister, but Paul defines that weaker brother or sister as remember, these are pagans, people who have lived their whole lives as pagans who have now become Christians, and he wants to be sensitive to the consciences of those who have recently made that decision. How far can I go in exercising my liberties? And now in chapter 9, he is going to use himself as Exhibit A. He is going to be the illustration of this very thing being discussed in chapter 8. Now, I'm going to summarize the first 18 verses because I really want us to sit for a moment with the last 8 verses in this chapter. In chapter 9 and verse 1, he says, "Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not the result of my work in the Lord? Even though I may not be an apostle to others, surely I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord." Now, there are a number of scholars who feel like what Paul's doing here is defending his apostleship, much like he has to do in the Galatian letter. But it appears to me that's not what's happening here. It seems to me Paul is asserting his apostleship. He's saying, you Corinthians know me to be an apostle. And so even though I'm an apostle, he then goes on to explain these other things. He's basing his argument on the fact that they know that. He's reaching back again to the beginning of chapter 8. And if knowledge, he's saying, if knowledge is the ground of defending and demanding one's rights, then he says, I have a greater right than any of you do. And then he pushes this even further. He says that he's already free or entitled to receive financial support from them. But he says, instead, I'm foregoing that right. Listen to how often he uses the word right in the next few verses. He says, this is my defense to those who sit in judgment on me. Don't we have the right to food and drink? Don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas? Or is it only I and Barnabas who lack the right to not work for a living? Part of the reason that I want to summarize these first 18 verses is oftentimes preachers use these verses to try and convince the congregation that they're not getting paid enough. Now, I do think Paul is saying if a person if their life is spent proclaiming the gospel, then they deserve to be paid for that. And yet he's saying, hey, I'm not going to do that with you, though. I'm not going to demand that right. Listen to what he goes on to say. Verse 9, he says, for it's written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain. I don't like being compared to an ox, but that's where I fit in this illustration. He says, if we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you? If others have this right of support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more? But we do not use this right. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ. Now, the reason I'm kind of skipping quickly through this is because of you, I don't have that concern. This church has been so stinking good to me and my wife. I just don't have this concern. But I know many preachers who do. But since it doesn't really apply all that much to us, we're going to just move on. Verse 15, he says, but I have not used any of these rights. Realize, labor was despised in the Greco-Roman world. The slaves did all the work. Everybody else just entertained themselves. And yet, Paul is making this point in his life by saying, even though I'm entitled for pay from you, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to work with my own hands to provide my living. And we know that he chose to be what? This is not a hard question, folks. He chose to be a tent maker. Now, I think that description is wider than what we often think. It really means he works with leather. It was labor intensive. Leather was heavy and it was tiring and it's unsanitary. In fact, a tanner of leather was considered to be unclean by the Jews. So he then says, next verse please, and am I not writing this in the hope that you will do such things for me? For I would rather die than allow anyone to deprive me of this boast. For when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast since I'm compelled to preach. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. Paul says here that he doesn't preach the gospel simply because he wants to. He preaches the gospel because he has to. He can't keep silent. It reminds me of the Church of Christ preacher from the early part of the 20th century, a man by the name of C.R. Nichols, and maybe some of you are familiar with at least this man by name. And C.R. Nichols used to teach his young preaching students, he would say, don't preach unless you have to. And that's what he was getting at here. Let it be such a calling upon you that you cannot do anything else but to preach the gospel. And I'm reminded of Jeremiah's words in Jeremiah chapter 20, when he said, you deceived me, Lord, and I was deceived. You overpowered me and prevailed. I'm ridiculed all day long. Everyone mocks me. Whenever I speak, I cry out proclaiming violence and destruction. So the word of the Lord has brought me insult and reproach all day long. But if I say, I will not mention his word or speak any more in his name, his word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. I am weary of holding it in. Indeed, I cannot. I've been there. I've been there when I've received so much criticism in past churches I've been in, and yet it would be real easy to just walk away from that, but there's just something that you just have to speak the word of the Lord. You can't be held back. Which brings us to the section that I want us to sit with for a moment. Because having established his rights, Paul now talks about the way he uses his freedom. He says this in verse 19. He says, though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I'm not free from God's law. I'm sorry, I didn't get all of that one. Though I'm not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, listen, to the weak, I became weak. Keep this in the context of what he's been talking about in chapter 8. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. Paul is reminding these Corinthian Christians that he doesn't go to the dining room in the local temples and have a meal of meat that's been sacrificed to idols. That he adjusts to the conscience of those who are young in faith, whom he calls weak, who do not have the liberty yet that he knows that he can practice. I didn't cover this last week, I should have, but back in chapter 8 and verse 10, and Kyle asked me a question about this last week, and so I wanted to come back and address this just momentarily. But he said, "For if someone with a weak conscience sees you with all knowledge eating in an idol's temple, won't that person be emboldened to eat what's sacrificed to idols?" You see, in Corinth, they have uncovered the ruins of temples, and in those temples one of them has 4 dining rooms in it. And people would use these for wedding receptions, for family gatherings. And so imagine you are one of these weak Christians. You're young in the faith. You've been a pagan your whole life. You've practiced this Greek mythology. You've sacrificed to the idols there in Corinth. And now you become a follower of Jesus. And one day you get an invitation to a wedding reception that's going to be held in the temple, in this pagan temple. What do you do? Do you go? You see, it depends on where that person's conscience was. Paul would have said, "I have no problem with going." But if there's any possibility that I will harm the conscience of a weaker Christian, I will not go. I really appreciate that attitude. It says a lot. To the weak, I became weak. So, we read on, "I become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all of this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessing." Paul exercised his freedoms, he says, in ways that would win more people. And this is such an unselfish, godly thing to do. Because Paul's overriding concern was winning people to Jesus. His overriding concern was not how much freedom do I have to do what I want to do. His overriding concern was how can I live this life of freedom in ways to bring more people to Jesus. And while the message is never changing, as culture changes, our methods of sharing the message change. And we need to be aware of that. When we make adjustments to meet people where they are, it creates an atmosphere in which we can effectively share the gospel, proclaim the gospel. And we need to be reminded, because sometimes we slip into periods of time where we don't talk about this much. I'm going to make an extra effort in the coming year to say more about this for us in this church. That winning the lost to Jesus is a part of our calling. It is who we are. And so I want to challenge you to speak a word for Jesus. And I want to challenge you with something else too. This sounds old-fashioned, but studies continually show this to be true. Nothing else is even close to this, in fact, for people choosing to come to a particular church. The reason the majority of people, it's over 50%, the reason most people choose to go to a particular church is because a friend of theirs asked them to go. So ask people to come to church. I want to challenge us in that. So what's your goal as a Christian? What are you aiming for? For God. Because, another question, why are you here in Decatur or in Wise County at this time in this place? Why? For some, just getting to church close to the starting time is their goal in life. And I'm grateful for that, because if you didn't, I wouldn't have anyone to preach to. But we need to expect more from ourselves than that. We need to expect more from our lives. We need to live with intentionality. We need to live with discipline. Several years ago, the London Bus Company was striving for efficiency. And so they made it their goal to always be on schedule. They were heads above all of their competition when it came to efficiency. How did they do it? Well, if a particular bus driver was running behind schedule, he was told that when he came to a bus stop, he was to pass it by even if there were people waiting for the bus there. And obviously, passengers got upset about that. And so to make matters worse, the bus company released a statement to try to explain it. Listen to their statement. It is impossible for us to maintain our schedules if we're always having to stop and pick up passengers. There's something wrong with that picture, isn't there? A bus company does not exist in order to meet a schedule. A bus company exists to pick people up and to drop people off. Brothers and sisters, as Christians, our purpose as disciples of Jesus Christ is to pick people up and to drop them off at the feet of Jesus. So listen, I want you to listen to how intent Paul is about living intentionally. He says in verse 24, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training." Paul is suggesting that we are vulnerable to Satan. But those who proclaim the gospel are especially vulnerable targets. And our enemy wants more than anything to silence or to at least mute the voice of the proclamation of the gospel. Paul wrote in Ephesians 6 and verse 12, though, that he recognized our struggle is really not with this world. Our struggle is with the invisible world, the forces of evil in the heavenly realms. And so he talks about the need for us to be self-disciplined. And in doing that, he uses athletic imagery that's drawn from the Greek games. So let me give you three things that I see in this text that help us to live with intention. The first is be focused. In Corinth, the Isthmian Games were held every 2 years, about 10 miles outside of the city of Corinth. And they were second only to the Olympic Games that were held every 4 years. I'm guessing the Isthmian Games would be similar to the Pan American Games. You're familiar with those Olympic athletes go to those games too, And so there was something similar going on in ancient Greece. I think Paul probably, in fact, I don't have much doubt that he had firsthand experience of having been to the Isthmian Games and witnessed what was going on there. Because they were held in 51 AD. Paul was in Corinth in 51 AD. And many athletes would come to the event. Thousands of spectators would come to the event. And guess what they stayed in when they were there? Tents. It's right up Paul's alley, okay? So Paul picks up on two contests that were held there. The contests were basically these: chariot races, foot races, wrestling, jumping, boxing, javelin, discus. Paul picks up on two of them: running and wrestling. And he says this in verse 25. He says, they do it to get a crown that will not last. But we do it to get a crown that will last forever. The athletes competed for the coveted crown. Do you know what it was? It was a wreath made out of wild celery. How long do you think that was going to last? Not very long. And yet they would discipline their bodies. They would diet and they would train and they would go through all of this for months and for years to win a wild celery wreath. But winning was the thing. The wreath was just a symbol of their success. And Paul says that we should be focused on a crown that lasts forever. This is imagery that Paul uses quite a bit. I'm just going to give you two examples of it. In Philippians 3:14, he says, I press on toward the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus. In 2 Timothy, he says this, I have fought the good fight. I've finished the race. I've kept the faith. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but to all who long for his appearing. This race, listen, brothers and sisters, it requires commitment, and it requires purpose, and it requires intention. Secondly, be passionate. He says, run in such a way as to get the prize. Paul says here that only one person gets the prize, so we must not push this illustration too hard or too far. He's not saying that only one Christian is going to get the prize and everyone else are losers. Rather, his point is that we should run as the one who's going to get the prize, with complete determination and with passion, giving our best and nothing less. How often do you see an out-of-shape, half-committed person winning a race? Winning requires that we give all we've got all the time. And then he says, be deliberate. Back to my question. What's your goal as a Christian? You ask many people that, and you're going to get a blank stare. Because you know what? Many of us never even think about the purpose of our lives in terms of how it will affect the kingdom. Listen to Paul. He says, therefore I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. I don't run like someone running aimlessly. Picture that sprinter. That sprinter's in his or her lane, and their eyes are fixed, and their eyes are fixed on the finish line. And that's where their eyes stay fixed, and they run for it. He says, I don't fight as a boxer beating the air. Paul's picturing shadow boxing. You know what shadow boxing is, don't you? This is the way boxers train. It's all in their head. It's imagery. They're using their fists and they're striking at imaginable places on that person they're going to be boxing. And it's exercise for them, but it's mental exercise as well. It's a visualization. But once that boxer steps into that ring, that boxer better stop using his imagination, and that boxer better start throwing some punches, or that boxer's going to be carried out of that ring in a box. So much of what we do here as a church, when we gather here, when we go to Bible classes, so much of what we're doing is shadow boxing. Nothing wrong with that. It's training. We train for the competition, though. And what is the competition? Winning people to Jesus. Oh man, I accidentally said that like a Jesus, you know. Sounded like a televangelist just then, didn't I? Lord, forgive me. And then Paul gives a reason. He gives a reason for this drastic self-discipline when he says, no, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave so that after I've preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. Paul? Disqualified. That suggests some breach of the rules. Paul's deeply aware of the irony here as he speaks. The irony is, here I am, I have brought people to Jesus, and could it be possible that I could be sidelined and watch as they receive the prize and I don't? Now, the text here has often been argued between Calvinists and Arminians. We tend to be from an Arminian background. And the argument is whether a person can lose his or her salvation. But I think Paul's words here, in context, are meant to be something different. His words seem to me to be a strict challenge to his audience to take spiritual self-discipline seriously. Paul's concern here seems to be that he would lose his ministry, that he would lose his opportunity to serve in the way he wants to serve. Let me remind you what Peter wrote in 2 Peter when he said, therefore, my brothers and sisters, make every effort. Make every effort. That sounds like Paul's language here, doesn't it? Make every effort to confirm your calling and election. For if you do these things, you will never stumble, and you will receive a rich welcome into the eternal kingdom of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. So Christians without goals are somewhat like Alice in the story Alice in Wonderland. In a conversation she had with the Cheshire Cat, Alice asked, would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here? And the Cheshire Cat asks, or says, that depends a good deal on where you want to go. Alice said, I don't much care where. To which the Cheshire Cat said, then it doesn't matter which way you go. What is your goal? Because unlike Alice, it does matter which way we're going. It matters. And so I want to close with a passage from Hebrews chapter 12, and I'm reading this from the Message, where the writer says, keep your eyes on Jesus, who both began and finished the race we're in. Study how he did it, because he never lost sight of where he was headed, that exhilarating finish in and with God. And that's what I want to call all of us to. As the Decatur Church of Christ in the coming year, let us be that intentional. So we offer an opportunity now. Maybe there's someone here who's never been baptized into Jesus, and we want to offer you an opportunity to come and do that, as we can be witnesses of that today. We offer an opportunity for you to come and have the elders pray over you. Maybe perhaps that you will be more intentional in 2020 as a follower of Jesus. You can go to room 102 and visit with an elder and his wife privately there and have them pray with you. But we want to encourage you now. I want to encourage you, and let's all be encouraged and encourage each other to live a life of intention. Let's stand and sing.